Our next interview is with John Waite Books. And John, give us a little bit about your background. Family, schools you went to, where you grew up, married, single, what?
Okay. Well, I was born in Spokane, Washington, lived the first 10 years of my life in and around Seattle. Then moved with my parents back to Vermont, where my mother's from. My father's from Seattle. Grew up attending public schools in rural Vermont and living across the street basically from my mother's parents. Went to school afterwards in Montana, the University of Montana, which was about as far away as I could get from Vermont at the time. And spent 7 years there just sort of kicking around. Took a lot of courses that I enjoyed, but I enjoyed being in Montana most of all. But then when it was time to get on with things, I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan and majored in Chinese studies then. And from there, spent a couple more years going to school in New York City at the graduate faculty of the New School. Then I didn't know what I wanted to do at all. I was...
Hold on for one.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay, so being in your late 20s and living in New York City and not knowing what the hell you want to do with yourself, well, there's a lot of people in New York that are like that, and I was certainly one of them. So I drifted from one thing to another. I did things like technical writing for a guy who was starting up some sort of networking company. I volunteered at the New Museum for Contemporary Art. I worked at the New School, where I eventually met my wife. And I bartended for 4 years at a nightclub. And
that must have been interesting.
Well, it was interesting. It was not your normal bookseller's route. And I was I was 40 years old when I entered the trade, but I'll get to that in a moment. From the time that I was a bartender at the Cat Club in New York City on East 13th Street, I went to work for the Social Register. Now, the Social Register, of course, everybody thinks of being this sort of highfalutin, and it is for some people, but the people who work there are basically nobodies from Queens and Brooklyn and wherever it happens to be. And, I noticed then that there was really quite a difference in most of the people who were there, what their educational experiences were, where they were from, what their backgrounds were, and where I was coming from in Vermont. But that 4 years that I spent working there actually was sort of interesting for one reason, and that is I had a friend who was working for Glenn Horowitz, who was one of the storied booksellers of our time. And when my friend decided to leave Glenn to go back to school, he introduced me to Glenn. And Glenn heard that I worked for the Social Register. And of course, that sort of interested him, and because Glenn's clientele is, from for the most part, from very wealthy and storied people in one way or another, so I got the job. After my friend left, I started as a basically as a receptionist, and because I had a pretty wide educational background, I took to the job pretty quickly and enjoyed cataloging, doing a lot of things that, for the most part, for the last 10 years, I'd done very little of. I mean, bartending, you don't really, encounter many books.
Not as a rule.
Yeah. Anyhow, got married and ended up going out to Long Island, where Glenn had a store. He was on East 44th Street, but he also was opening up a shop in East Hampton, Long Island. And I went out there and I helped Glenn's father basically run the place for a couple of years. And after, that was a very critical thing because Glenn, he was interested in a lot of different kind of things, although his career was basically made as a modern first dealer and as a dealer in archives, important archives. Out there on Long Island, he had a lot of different kinds of books. And it was basically my entree to a lot of books that were, some things were mostly secondhand, but a lot of things were more interesting in that. And he had interesting collections that I could catalog and work with. So that was an extremely important step in getting involved in this trade. I worked for Glenn for a total of about 3 years, and by mutual consent, we parted ways. And I wanted to continue doing something in bookselling, although I hadn't really had much experience. I'd had some exposure to books, and that was it. And so I moved with my wife and my child, who was a young girl at the time, back to Vermont, back basically to the little village that I'd grown up in, and started with absolutely nothing. And being in your 40s and trying to start a business with with some experience but not any capital, I believe me, that's a bit of a challenge. And that's how I got started in it.
What was your general impression of working with someone of Glenn Horowitz's repute?
Well, Glenn is a brilliant bookseller.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
Was he easy or hard to work with?
Yeah. He was demanding, and you would expect nothing else.
Yeah.
Because he's a very successful bookseller. He is, his reputation in the trade at the time was somewhat checkered. I think that's fair to say. But as a result of working with Glenn, I learned how to catalog a book, learned how to research a book, and I learned how to write something up that might be interesting to somebody. And for that, I owe Glenn a debt of gratitude.
When you went back to Vermont and you started becoming a bookseller from nowhere,
mm-hmm.
What procedures? Did you go out scouting? Did you hit the shops? Did you go to auctions? Did you go to book? What was your modus operandi?
Yeah, well, it was a conundrum for me because here I am sitting up in a little town in Vermont, and even though I know some local people who I grew up with, I didn't know anybody else. I'd been away for 25 years, didn't have any money. The first couple months were looking pretty grim, and I didn't know how I was going to do anything, quite frankly. But then, as things happen, a little windfall occurred, and that is a guy who is totally unknown to the trade, but he's made a career. He had a regular job, but he had a second job. His second job was basically he had a bunch of pickers who worked for him. And he was a guy who pickers would sell things to, and then he would sell them to dealers. Now, I got introduced to him because I happened to know somebody who worked with him, one of these kinds of things. He had gotten into a house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the sole surviving person in this family was a grown son whose father was a very he was a significant journalist, a literary journalist from Chicago during the teens and the 20s. They had later moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this guy he was in the owner of this collection, the person who collected it, whose name was Llewellyn Jones, had died years and years before. The son had been sitting around, was a major eccentric, apparently, had his father's library and all his father's letters from all kinds of poets and writers.
Wow.
Well, my contact, whose name is Joe, had somehow gotten into this, bought the whole thing.
Wow.
God knows for how much money. And said, John, this is your chance, basically, to do something here, but you have to work with me. You're not going to buy it. You're going to sell it for me. And that's how I got started. It was a major poetry library with major numbers of letters from well-known poets who had all written to this guy back in the teens and 20s and the 30s. And I did my first catalog was a poetry catalog from this library. And that's how things got started. You know, so much in this business I found is a matter of, well, you have to go out there, first of all. You have to be active. You have to be looking for things. You have to make yourself available. But if you do that, it occurs to me that things do happen. And that's exactly what happened in this case. It got me started. I made some good sales. I made some contacts as a result of it. And before long, I was doing book fairs. I didn't have a book to do a book fair before. I didn't have a book.
Really?
You know, I'd never collected books. I didn't have any money to buy them, but suddenly I had a collection, and I ran with it as far as I could, as hard as I could. And after that, other things started happening. You know, I started going to book fairs, started scouting things. You know, I mean, it was one thing to sit around and catalog a book, but it's quite another thing to go out and be able to buy things. Yeah. You know,
make a profit.
To make a profit. That's a totally, and that's something that Glenn had. You know, because I was sitting around cataloging stuff, I didn't really know about that part of the business, and that is something I had to learn on my own.
It's a hard lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
So obviously, some of your fond recollections of your early days in the trade all relate back to this one situation.
That's right.
Are you still a specialist in poetry and literature today?
Not at all.
Not at all.
No. What has happened is I've evolved. You know, I mean, the trade, as we all know, has evolved to be specialist friendly. I mean, that's the way it is. I have remained a person who is opportunistically friendly. I look for those, whether I'm scouting books or whether it's somebody who's calling me or whatever, opportunities that allow me to learn something and also to pick up something at a price where I'm pretty certain that I can resell it and make a profit. And I don't care if it's poetry or gardening books or early Americana or a music book or anything. I'm out there looking for something that I think, and what I believe I've done is to some degree, I can't rely on a great amount of education about things because I haven't spent enough time in any subject area to really master that. But what I have done, I think, is get a sense of what a valuable and a rare book or object is. And also just an intuitive sense of whether something is priced right or is underpriced. And I've leveraged that to at least a modest career. Nobody would mistake me for a big-time bookseller, but it's allowed me to make a living, and that's fine with me.
It's fine with most of us. Besides Glenn Horowitz, who were some of the booksellers who were mentors or people you would go to for advice or ask an opinion?
I didn't really have mentors in that sense. What I did have was friends.
Yeah.
And I had friends and I had catalogs. You know, when I was starting out, I was working with poetry books. I was working with gardening books because I did a big gardening catalog as well. I looked at people who were handling poetry in their catalogs. What they were. I was learning from their catalogs, whether it was James Jaffe, who has done, made a career of good poetry. Later on, I didn't know Jet at the time. Jet Whitehead certainly, and there were other people as well who did a lot with poetry, who I could learn from what they'd done on paper. Same with gardening, whether it was Hinkenwall at the time, or Charlie Wood, of course, did lots of gardening catalogs of gardening and architecture. That's where I learned. But I only, in learning by doing and picking up friends along the way, friends in the trade, that's where I've learned my major lessons from my peers.
Absolutely.
And not from somebody who's taken me under their wing.
That's cool. What aspects of the book business have changed since the Internet revolution, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I came into this game, I rarely, compared to most people who I suspect you're interviewing, on the latter side of things. I started in the book trade working with Glenn in 1992. I went out on my own in 1995. And it was really after, the book trade was just in 1995 beginning to, the internet was just beginning then to really make an effect.
Make a difference.
Right. And I was an early user of ABAA Books, and I was, selling a few things, not much on eBay, but mostly I went to ABAA Books pretty directly. And, the very early days of ABAA Books were pretty good for me. I sold a fair amount that way. But I'm not a person, I'm a Luddite at heart. I am not a person who is particularly adept in any kind of technology. And I'm much more a hands-on kind of person. I like to feel things, touch things, and my contact with books is a physical thing. I don't have the inclination, I don't have the patience either to sit and buy and sell stuff on the internet. I like to get out there, and I travel a lot, and I do produce some catalogs. I have produced some catalogs, but as far as the internet goes, I've mostly avoided it. I was on ABAA Books for quite a while, but I think the most I ever had was maybe 250 books at any one time, and now I don't have any internet presence whatsoever. No. That's not to say I might not go back and do something, but right now I don't have anything, and I don't use it at all.
What made you say, I don't want to be on the internet?
I found it more of I was one of these people who was getting 2 stars from ABAA Books because some book that I had on there that I'd sold I forgot to take off, and I said to myself, well, who needs this?
So it's aggravation.
If I have 500,000, well, if I have 50,000 books on the internet and I'm selling 100 books a day from that, well, geez, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
But my stock was always so limited and so small, and half the time the best things that I had nobody would ever find because they were so rare. The thing about the internet is that it works best for those things that people already know about. But if you try to sell something on the internet that nobody knows about, which is incidentally is almost the definition of a rare item, whether it's a rare book or a broadside. If the people don't know what to look for, how are you going to sell it on the internet? That's a problem. I think that's why, as my business has evolved, and I sell mostly to the trade and institutions. I have very few, retail clients. I go out and I tell people about it, and that's the way it works for me.
How many catalogs a year do you issue?
I only issue 1 or 2.
1 or 2. What is your main selling tool?
My main selling tool is an email and a phone call.
Okay.
That's how I do most of my business, and here at the book shows. Of course, that's hugely important to me because probably 60 to 70% of my business is trade generated.
How many book fairs a year do you do?
Probably 12, 14.
So you do a lot of regional book fairs as well?
Yeah, I do.
Do you do book fairs out of the country?
None. No.
Okay. If you were entering the book trade today, how would you do it, or would you do it?
I would do it only because, for the same reasons that I start with, I didn't have anything else to do. I didn't have any other. It's something I fell into. It's not something I planned for, but it happened to be the most simpatico and the thing that I actually could do, the thing that I enjoyed doing. And what better reason for doing something than you enjoy it?
It seems to be a common thread through today's interviews. That people have all said the same thing, that they're doing something that they enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And that's really important. What do you see as some of the great challenges facing the trade as we look forward into the future? Put your crystal ball on for a minute.
Well, of course, the biggest challenge of all is whether or not there'll be any customers for the kinds of things that we sell. But I think the biggest challenge for the trade will be to figure out if the kind of material, the kind of stock that people have dealt in for years is falling by the wayside, in the sense that all the customers are dying, going away, and they're not being generated elsewhere, then what? It's not to say that people are going to stop buying stuff altogether. It's just that maybe tastes are changing or something's changing. So how does are we going to be able to figure out where to go with it? And I don't think anybody has, I don't think there's anybody who can wear the title of prophet to know exactly how things are going to change in another 5 or 10 years. But we know that things are changing. I mean, one thing is for certain. I mean, in my own experience, I don't know about anybody else's, paper seems to be generating a lot more excitement these days than books, and I don't think that has always been the case. I think that's something that's relatively new, and that's where I'm doing a lot of my business is ephemera.
A gathering was in a couple of interviews ago, and they were saying that they don't really want to do business in books. They're just as happy just to do ephemera. Yeah,
I think that this is well, for one thing, people are in the trade, people are very disappointed to buy a book and find out that there's already 20 copies out there.
At half the price.
Nobody gets excited about that anymore. So people want to deal in objects that are more or less unique, or at least truly scarce. And ephemera still has that allure. I mean, there's a lot of pieces out there that you're not going to find another one of. I mean, they're not easy to find, but I mean, for me, I can't answer for the rest of the trade, but that's definitely the direction my business increasingly is taken towards, printed ephemera and manuscript material that, by definition, there's only one.
Uniqueness is what you're looking for.
That's right, and I think that's where, no matter what subject area you're dealing in, that unique item is going to be more or less the item that is going to be the selling point in the future. I mean, not to say that the kind of books that are the big deal is the high spots, whether they're truly antiquarian stuff, Americana, or modern first. There's always going to be a market for that stuff, but not everybody can deal at that level. Not everybody has capitalization to deal with it. So the rest of us have to figure out what is it that we can make a profit on. And right now, ephemera and manuscript material looks like a pretty good bet.
Yeah, because of its uniqueness.
Yes.
One last question before I let you go, John. If a young person comes to you and says, Mr. Waite, I'm thinking about becoming a bookseller, what good piece of advice would you like to give them?
Well, I would say, first of all, if you want to be a bookseller, you probably would be saving yourself a lot of disappointment by avoiding that path. Because I think, for the very reasons I've been talking about, a lot of the sale of books is just going to be tougher and tougher unless you're coming at it where you've got a ready-made stock and you're well capitalized. Then maybe okay. But everybody else, I'd say try to think about either if you want to deal in antiquarian material and printed or manuscript materials, go that way. But otherwise, I would say avoid books.
Avoid books at all costs. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Great interview, John. Thank you.